Go ahead, my sister said, lifting her glass with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Tell them how you think you deserve a share of something you never helped build. The room laughed softly, politely, the kind of laughter people use when they're not sure if they should be uncomfortable yet, and I remember noticing how easily that sound filled the space, like it had been waiting for permission, like this moment had been rehearsed without me. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't rush to defend myself. I simply watched her, the way you watch someone who doesn't realize they've already said too much, and I let her finish. My name is Tige Monroe, and I've spent most of my life learning that in my family, silence is often mistaken for weakness, and composure is usually taken as agreement. That night, sitting at my parents' long oak dining table with 6 guests, a family attorney, and my sister positioned at the center like she owned the air itself, I understood exactly what role they expected me to play, and for a moment, I almost played it again. The conversation had started innocently enough, or at least that's how it looked on the surface. My mother had insisted on hosting a formal dinner, complete with polished silverware and wine she only brought out when there was something to prove, and my father had invited Mr. Caldwell, the attorney who had handled our family's estate matters for years, though no one said that part out loud. My sister, Vanessa, had arrived early, dressed like she was stepping into a magazine shoot rather than a family gathering, and from the moment she walked in, she carried herself with that familiar confidence that always seemed to grow stronger when I was in the room. She greeted everyone warmly, laughed easily, and then, almost effortlessly, shifted the attention toward herself, toward her success, her lifestyle, her version of what this family represented. I greeted her the same way I always did, with a calm smile and a simple, "It's good to see you, Vanessa," because I had learned a long time ago that meeting her energy directly never led anywhere worth going. But that didn't stop her. It never did. Somewhere between the second course and the first refill of wine, the topic shifted, as it always seemed to when she was present, toward money, toward success, toward what people had and what they didn't. One of the guests asked about business expansions, and Vanessa leaned back slightly, glancing in my direction just long enough for me to notice before she spoke. "Well," she said lightly, "some of us are actually contributing to the family's future, and some of us," she paused, letting the sentence hang just long enough to draw attention, "prefer to stay comfortable where they are." There it was. Subtle enough to pass as a comment, sharp enough to land exactly where she intended. My mother gave a soft laugh, the kind she uses when she wants to keep the mood pleasant without correcting anything, and my father didn't say a word, which, in our house, had always meant agreement. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my expression steady. I had heard variations of this for years. It wasn't new. What was new was the audience. Vanessa wasn't just speaking to me anymore. She was performing. I mean, she continued, now looking directly at one of the guests, "You'd think if someone expected to be included in something as serious as an inheritance, they'd at least show the kind of initiative that justifies it." Another ripple of laughter. Softer this time. More uncertain. I could feel the shift in the room, that subtle tension that builds when people start realizing they're watching something they weren't fully invited to. Still, no one stopped her. No one ever did. I nodded once, almost to myself, as if acknowledging something internal rather than responding to her, and I took a small sip of water, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Because the truth was, I already knew how this moment would unfold. I had seen the pattern too many times. She would push, the room would follow, and I would be expected to absorb it quietly, to keep the peace, to make her look generous by comparison. And for a second, I considered doing exactly that. But then she leaned forward slightly, resting her glass against the table, and said the one thing she shouldn't have said, the one line. That crossed from performance into assumption. "Let's be honest," she added, her tone still smooth, still measured, "Tige doesn't really have a place in those conversations." That was when everything changed. I didn't say anything, not yet. I kept my gaze steady, not on Vanessa, but on the center of the table, as if I were considering her words carefully instead of reacting to them, and that small decision alone seemed to stretch the silence just enough to make a few of the guests shift in their seats, It is interesting how quickly a room changes when someone refuses to follow the script everyone expects. My mother cleared her throat lightly, offering a practiced smile as she reached for her wine glass. "Vanessa," she said gently, "that is not necessary." But her tone lacked correction. It was not a boundary. It was a suggestion, the kind she always used when she wanted to appear fair without actually challenging anything. Vanessa gave a soft laugh in response, brushing it off with a casual wave of her hand. "I am only being honest," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, almost pleasant, which somehow made it land harder. "We are talking about serious matters. It is not unreasonable to acknowledge who is actually contributing." One of the guests, a man I recognized as a colleague of my father's, glanced at me briefly before looking down at his plate, as if eye contact might pull him into something he did not want to be part of. Another guest adjusted her napkin, her smile tightening just slightly, the kind of subtle discomfort people display when they realize they are witnessing something personal dressed up as conversation. I let the moment sit. I did not rush to fill it. For years, I had responded too quickly, tried to explain myself, tried to soften the edges of what was being said, and all it ever did was give Vanessa more space to reposition herself as the reasonable one. This time, I did something different. I listened. "If we are going to discuss inheritance," Vanessa continued, now leaning back again as if she had already won the point, "then it should reflect effort, not obligation. That is just how the real world works." My father nodded once, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. I always saw it. That quiet reinforcement, that subtle alignment that told her she was not overstepping, she was simply saying what everyone else was thinking. He did not look at me. He rarely did in moments like this. It was easier that way. Easier to let the narrative settle without interruption. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap, not out of nervousness, but out of control, grounding myself in the stillness I had learned to maintain. "I understand your perspective," I said finally, my voice even, calm, deliberate, the kind of tone that does not ask for permission but does not demand attention either. That alone made her pause, just slightly. Vanessa tilted her head, studying me, as if trying to decide whether I was about to comply or resist. "Do you?" she asked, a faint edge slipping into her voice. "Because from where I am sitting, it does not seem like you have taken those realities very seriously." There it was again, the quiet escalation, the invitation to defend myself on her terms. I met her gaze then, not with challenge, but with clarity. "I take responsibility very seriously," I replied. "Perhaps in ways that are not always visible at this table." My words were measured, respectful, but they did not bend. That distinction mattered. My mother shifted again, this time more noticeably, as if sensing that the conversation was moving into a space she could no longer smooth over with polite laughter. "Let us focus on dinner," she said, reaching for the serving dish, attempting to redirect the energy back to something neutral. But Vanessa was not finished. She rarely was when she felt the room leaning in her favor. "I am only trying to keep things realistic," she added, her eyes still on me. "We all have to earn our place eventually." The phrase hung in the air, heavier now, stripped of its casual tone, and I could feel the attention of the table settle more firmly, not because anyone wanted conflict, but because no one could ignore it anymore. I nodded once more, slower this time, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided long before this dinner began. "You are right," I said quietly. "People do have to earn their place." And for a brief second, she smiled, thinking I had agreed with her, thinking I had stepped back into the role she understood. But what she did not realize was that I had already stepped out of it. And that difference, small as it seemed, was the only thing that mattered now. I could feel the shift settle deeper into the room, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, the kind of quiet that signals something is about to tip even if no one knows exactly how yet. And I noticed how Vanessa's smile held just a fraction longer than it should have, like she was trying to anchor herself in the version of this conversation she believed she controlled. She picked up her glass again, taking a slow sip, eyes never fully leaving me, and then she set it down with deliberate care. Exactly, she said, her tone soft but sharpened at the edges, so I am glad we agree on that much. A few of the guests nodded faintly, not because they fully supported her, but because agreement is often the safest place to stand when a conversation becomes uncomfortable. My father shifted in his chair, straightening slightly as if preparing to bring the discussion back to something more formal, something less personal, but he did not speak yet. He rarely interrupted Vanessa when she was building a point. My mother reached for the serving spoon again, placing a portion onto one of the guests' plates, her movements precise, controlled, as if focusing on small details might keep the larger tension from becoming undeniable. I let the moment breathe. I did not rush to fill the space with explanation. That was the difference this time. Before, I would have tried to clarify what I did, justify my choices, make them easier to understand. But understanding was never the issue in this family. Perception was. And perception, I had learned, was rarely changed by explanation. Vanessa leaned forward again, resting her elbows lightly against the table, her posture confident, assured. I just think, she continued, that when we talk about legacy, we should be honest about who is actually building it. She gestured subtly toward my father, toward the house, toward the carefully arranged evening. Itself. It is not about feelings. It is about contribution. The word lingered. Contribution. It had always been her favorite measure. Not because it was accurate, but because it was easy to define in a way that excluded me. I tilted my head slightly, considering her words as if they were new, even though I had heard versions of them for years. And how do you define that? I asked calmly. The question was simple, but it landed differently than anything I had said before. It did not defend. It did not argue. It invited her to commit. Vanessa paused, just briefly, and then smiled again, that same composed expression she wore whenever she believed she was about to reinforce her position. Results, she said. Growth. Expansion. Real, measurable impact. She glanced at the guests as she spoke, as if drawing them into agreement, as if their presence validated her definition. Not just maintaining something. Actually elevating it. My father nodded again, more visibly this time, and one of the guests murmured something that sounded like agreement, though it lacked conviction. I noticed Mr. Caldwell, the attorney, for the first time since the conversation had shifted. He had been quiet the entire evening, observing, listening, his expression neutral in a way that suggested he was used to sitting in rooms where people revealed more than they intended. He did not speak, but he was paying attention. That mattered more than anything else at the table. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly against the edge of my plate, and I allowed a small, polite smile to form, not defensive, not dismissive, simply present. That is a clear definition, I said. Thank you for explaining it. Vanessa's expression flickered, just for a moment, as if she had expected resistance, not acknowledgement. People often prepare for conflict. They rarely prepare for calm agreement that carries no submission. Of course, she replied, recovering quickly. I believe in being direct. So do I said quietly. The words were simple, but something in the way they landed shifted the air again. My mother stopped mid-motion for a second before continuing to serve. My father glanced toward me. Briefly, then away. Vanessa held my gaze longer this time, searching, measuring, trying to understand what had changed without admitting that anything had. I could feel it building now, that subtle pressure that comes right before something surfaces, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was not reacting to the moment. I was guiding it. Not forcefully, not obviously, but deliberately. And the room, whether they realized it or not, was beginning to follow. I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip, then setting it down with the same quiet precision Vanessa had used earlier. Then perhaps, I said, my voice steady, measured, we should make sure we are all working with the same information before we continue. The sentence was calm, respectful, almost courteous, but it carried a weight that had not been there before, and I saw it register, not fully, not yet, but enough. Vanessa's smile did not disappear, but it tightened. Just slightly. And that was the first sign that something, finally, was no longer in her control. Vanessa did not respond immediately, and that alone was unusual enough to draw attention, because she was never the type to hesitate when she believed she had the upper hand. Instead, she studied me with a sharper focus now, as if trying to identify what had shifted beneath the surface without giving me the satisfaction of asking directly. "What do you mean by that?" she finally said, her tone still controlled, but no longer effortless. It was a question, but it was also a test, an attempt to pull me back into a position where I would need to explain myself on her terms. I did not take the invitation. I let a small pause settle first, just long enough for the room to feel it, then I turned my attention slightly toward the far end of the table where Mr. Caldwell sat, quietly observing everything with the kind of patience that comes from years of listening before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell," I said politely, my voice steady and respectful, "would you mind clarifying something for the table?" That was the moment the atmosphere changed in a way that no one could ignore. My mother's hand stopped midway as she reached for her glass, her eyes flicking between me and the attorney. My father's posture straightened more noticeably this time, his attention sharpening in a way that suggested he had not expected me to bring anyone else into the conversation. Vanessa's expression tightened, just slightly, though she quickly masked it with a composed smile. "Clarifying what exactly?" she asked, her voice lighter than before, but the edge beneath it was now unmistakable. I kept my tone calm, almost conversational. "The structure of the estate," I replied. "Specifically, how contributions are defined in the context of future distribution." The phrasing was deliberate, neutral on the surface, but precise enough to shift the discussion from opinion to fact. Mr. Caldwell set his napkin down carefully before responding, his movements unhurried, his expression measured. He glanced briefly at my father, as if confirming that it was acceptable to speak, and after a short pause, my father gave a small nod, though his jaw had tightened in a way I had not seen earlier that evening. "Of course," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice calm and even, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being the final word in complicated matters. "The current estate plan accounts for multiple forms of contribution, not solely financial growth or external expansion." Vanessa let out a soft laugh, almost reflexive, as if to dismiss the statement before it could fully land. "That sounds very technical," she said lightly. "But in practical terms, it still comes down to who is actually building something, does it not?" Mr. Caldwell did not smile. He did not mirror her tone. He simply looked at her, then back at the table. "In practical terms," he replied, "it includes operational oversight, asset management, strategic decision-making, and contractual authority." The words settled into the room with a weight that was different from anything said so far, not because they were louder, but because they carried definition. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. It was a small movement, easy to miss, but I noticed it. I always noticed the small shifts. "And who exactly has that authority?" she asked, her voice still composed, but now more direct, less performative. My mother shifted again, this time leaning slightly toward my father as if waiting for him to answer, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed somewhere between Mr. Caldwell and me, calculating, reconsidering. I did not rush the moment. I did not fill the silence. I allowed it to expand just enough to make the answer matter. Mr. Caldwell folded his hands neatly on the table before speaking again. "The authority is currently assigned to a single individual," he said. Another pause followed, heavier now, more deliberate. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her composure still intact, but her focus sharper than before. "And that would be," she pressed. I lifted my glass, taking a slow, measured sip, not to delay out of hesitation, but to maintain control of the pacing, then I set it down gently. "I believe that is the part worth clarifying," I said calmly, my eyes meeting hers without challenge, without hesitation, simply present. The room went still in a way that felt different from earlier, no longer casual, no longer uncertain, but fully attentive. Vanessa held my gaze, and for the first time that evening, there was something new beneath her confidence, something she had not prepared for, something that did not fit into the version of the story she had been telling. It was not fear yet. Not fully. But it was the beginning of it. And she knew it. No one spoke right away, and that silence felt heavier than anything Vanessa had said all evening, because it was no longer polite or uncertain, it was deliberate, the kind that forms when people realize they are no longer listening to opinions but waiting for something that could not be taken back once it was said. Vanessa's fingers remained wrapped around her glass, but she was no longer lifting it, no longer performing ease, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was steady, but it required more control than before. "Then go ahead," she said, her eyes locked on mine, "clarify it." It sounded confident, but there was a subtle tightness underneath, something that had not been there earlier, something that told me she was no longer entirely certain of where this was going. I did not answer her directly. Instead, I turned my attention back to Mr. Caldwell, allowing the structure of the moment to remain intact, allowing the authority in the room to speak before I did. He inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging that the next step was his to take, and then he spoke with the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. "The individual assigned with full operational authority over the estate," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, "is Miss Monroe." For a second, the statement did not register. Not because it was unclear, but because it did not align with the narrative that had been building at the table. Vanessa blinked once, slowly, as if recalibrating, her expression holding in place just a fraction too long before shifting. "Miss Monroe?" she repeated, a faint crease forming between her brows. "You mean," she stopped herself, but the question had already formed in the room. My mother's gaze moved quickly between me and Mr. Caldwell, her composure slipping just enough to reveal genuine confusion. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice softer now, no longer smoothing, but searching. My father did not speak, but his attention sharpened in a way that was impossible to miss, his earlier certainty replaced with something more cautious, more calculating. Mr. Caldwell did not adjust his tone. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied calmly. "The designation has been in place for some time." Vanessa let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief, but it lacked the ease she had carried earlier. "That does not make sense," she said, her voice tightening despite her attempt to keep it controlled. "If that were true, we would have known." I met her gaze then, not with challenge, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "You were informed," I said evenly. "You just did not consider it relevant at the time." The words were not sharp, but they landed with precision, and I saw it register, not fully, but enough to unsettle her. "That is not possible," she replied quickly, her composure beginning to strain at the edges. "I review everything related to this family. I would not overlook something like that." I gave a small, polite nod. "You reviewed what you believed mattered," I said. "Those are not always the same thing." The room shifted again, this time more noticeably. One of the guests set their glass down more carefully than necessary. Another leaned back slightly, creating a small distance from the center of the table, as if instinctively stepping away from something that had become more serious than anticipated. My mother looked toward my father, searching for confirmation, for correction, for anything that would restore the structure she understood, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable, his focus now entirely on me. Vanessa leaned forward, her posture no longer relaxed, her control slipping just enough to reveal urgency beneath it. "Then explain it," she said, her voice lower now, more direct. "Explain why that authority would be assigned to you." There it was. Not dismissal. Not mockery. A question. And questions, in this family, only came when certainty was gone. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, my tone steady. "Because the role was never about visibility," I replied. "It was about responsibility." I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize the words. I simply stated them, and let them settle. Vanessa held my gaze, searching again, but this time there was no performance to rely on, no easy way to redirect the conversation into something she could control. The room was no longer following her lead. It was waiting. And for the first time that evening, she was no longer the one guiding what came next. Vanessa did not respond immediately this time, and that hesitation was no longer subtle, it was visible, the kind that spreads through posture before it ever reaches words, and I watched as she leaned back slightly, as if creating distance might help her regain control of a situation that was no longer responding to her the way it had only minutes ago. Her eyes moved briefly toward my father, searching, not for approval this time, but for confirmation, for something that would restore the structure she understood, but he remained still, his expression closed, his silence now heavier than any agreement he had given her earlier. Responsibility, she repeated, the word slower now, less certain, as if testing it, trying to find a flaw in it. You are saying that as if it explains everything. I tilted my head slightly, not dismissing her, not correcting her, simply acknowledging the gap between what she expected and what she was hearing. It does not explain everything, I said calmly. But it explains more than what has been discussed so far. My mother set her glass down more carefully than necessary, the faint sound of it touching the table drawing attention in a way it would not have earlier in the evening. Tige, she said, her voice softer now, almost cautious, why was this not made clear to the family? The question carried more than curiosity. It carried discomfort, and beneath that, something closer to concern. I met her gaze briefly before answering, keeping my tone even, respectful. It was documented, I said. The information was available. It simply was not prioritized. I did not look at Vanessa when I said it, but the implication did not require direct acknowledgement. Vanessa let out a quiet breath, her composure tightening again, but this time it felt constructed rather than natural. That sounds like deflection, she said, her voice regaining a sharper edge, though it no longer carried the same confidence. If something like that existed, it would have been discussed openly. That is how serious matters are handled. Mr. Caldwell shifted slightly in his seat, not interrupting, but preparing, the kind of movement that signaled he would speak if necessary. I raised my hand just slightly, not to stop him, but to indicate that I would answer first. Serious matters are documented clearly, I said. Whether they are discussed openly depends on whether people are willing to hear them. The room went still again, but this time it was not anticipation, it was realization beginning to form, slow but undeniable. One of the guests glanced toward Mr. Caldwell, then back at me, as if reassessing the entire context of the evening. Another shifted their chair slightly, the subtle scrape against the floor louder than it should have been. Vanessa leaned forward again, her control narrowing into focus. Then be specific, she said. What exactly does that responsibility include? There was no mockery in her tone now. No performance. Just a direct question, stripped of everything she had relied on before. I allowed a brief pause, not to create tension, but because the answer deserved precision. Oversight of all major assets, I said. Approval of strategic decisions. Authorization of financial restructuring when necessary. I spoke clearly, without emphasis, letting the structure of the words carry their own weight. Vanessa's expression changed again, more noticeably this time. Not disbelief. Not dismissal. Something closer to recalculation. That is not a passive role, she said quietly. No, I replied. It is not. My father shifted then, finally, his hand moving slightly on the table as if he were about to speak, but he stopped himself, his attention fixed on me in a way that suggested he was re-evaluating something he had taken for granted. My mother looked between us, her composure now fully unsettled, though she was trying to maintain it. When did this happen? She asked. I met her gaze again, steady, composed. It has been in place for over a year, I said. The words settled into the room with a finality that no one could ignore. Vanessa's hand moved slightly, her fingers loosening from the glass, then tightening again as if grounding herself. A year, she repeated, almost to herself. And no one thought to mention it. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence follow her words, because this time, the silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had been overlooked, everything that had been dismissed, everything that had been assumed. And for the first time that evening, the imbalance that had always defined these moments was no longer invisible. It was sitting at the table, undeniable, and no one could pretend not to see it anymore. Vanessa did not look at anyone else now, not at our parents, not at the guests, not even at Mr. Caldwell, her attention fixed entirely on me as if the rest of the room had faded into something secondary, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it carried something sharper than before, something closer to urgency than control. "If that is true," she said, choosing each word carefully, "then you have been making decisions without any input from the rest of us." It was not an accusation in the way she had used earlier, not dressed in humor or softened with performance, but it was still an attempt to reframe the situation, to move the focus away from what she had missed and toward what she could question. I nodded once, acknowledging the structure of her statement without accepting the premise beneath it. "Decisions have been made within the scope of the authority assigned," I replied evenly. "The same way any structured responsibility operates." She leaned forward slightly, her posture tightening, her composure narrowing into something more direct. "That is not how families operate," she said. "Not when it involves something this significant." I held her gaze, calm, steady, not confrontational. "That depends on how a family defines structure," I said. "And whether it values clarity over assumption." The words landed cleanly, without force, but they carried enough weight to shift the focus again, not away from her, but deeper into the space she was trying to control. My mother drew in a small breath, her hands now resting still against the table, no longer moving, no longer attempting to smooth anything over. "Tige," she said softly, "what kind of decisions are we talking about?" There was something different in her tone now, something closer to concern than discomfort, as if she was beginning to understand that this was no longer about a misunderstanding, but about something that had already been in motion. I turned slightly toward her, maintaining the same measured calm. "Operational adjustments," I said. "Contractual reviews. Risk assessments when necessary." I did not elaborate further. I did not need to. The language itself was enough. Vanessa's expression shifted again, more visibly this time, the confidence she had carried earlier no longer anchoring her the same way. "Risk assessments," she repeated, and this time the words did not sound dismissive. They sounded cautious. "What kind of risk would require you to act without consulting anyone?" There it was. Not control. Not superiority. A question shaped by uncertainty. I allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next was understood exactly as intended. "The kind that affects long-term stability," I replied. "The kind that requires timely response rather than delayed discussion." Vanessa's fingers tightened again around her glass, but she did not lift it. "And you decided that alone," she said. With full authorization, I corrected calmly. The distinction mattered. I could see it register. The room had gone completely still now, not out of politeness, but because no one was willing to interrupt what had become something far more significant than a conversation. Mr. Caldwell remained composed, observing, allowing the exchange to unfold without interference, which only reinforced the structure of what was being revealed. My father finally spoke then, his voice measured, but no longer distant. "What specific actions have been taken?" he asked. It was the first direct question he had asked me all evening, and it carried a weight that acknowledged, at least in part, that the ground beneath this discussion had shifted. I met his gaze, steady, respectful. "Financial exposure was reduced," I said. "Several liabilities were restructured." I paused briefly, then added, "and one external dependency was removed." The last part settled differently. Not louder. Not more dramatic. Just more precise. Vanessa leaned forward again, this time without hesitation, her composure now fully focused, no longer performative at all. "What dependency?" she asked. The question came quickly, almost instinctively, and for the first time that evening, there was no attempt to soften it. I held her gaze for a moment longer, not avoiding, not pressing, simply allowing the reality of the moment to settle fully before answering. The one tied to your husband's expansion, I said calmly. The words did not rise in volume. They did not need to. The effect was immediate. Vanessa's expression changed in a way she could not fully contain, the composure she had maintained finally cracking just enough to reveal something real beneath it. Not anger. Not disbelief. Something closer to realization. And that was the moment everything shifted, not gradually, not subtly, but completely, because for the first time, she was no longer speaking from assumption. She was reacting to something she had not seen coming at all. Vanessa did not speak right away, and this time the silence around her felt different from anything earlier that night, not controlled, not strategic, but unsteady, like something inside her had shifted faster than she could recover from, and I watched as her posture changed in small, telling ways, her shoulders tightening, her fingers loosening from the glass and then gripping it again as if she needed something physical to hold on to while she processed what had just been said. That does not make sense, she said finally, but her voice had lost its earlier clarity, the words coming out slower, less certain, as if she was speaking while still trying to understand the ground beneath her. You would not have had the authority to do that without approval. It was not the same tone she had used before. There was no mockery left in it, no performance for the room. It was a statement shaped by disbelief, but also by something else, something closer to concern. I did not respond immediately. I let the quiet stretch just enough for the weight of her words to settle, then I answered in the same calm, measured tone I had maintained all evening. The authority was granted with that scope included, I said. Specifically for situations where delay would increase exposure. The phrasing was deliberate, not defensive, not aggressive, simply precise. Vanessa shook her head slightly, a reflex more than a decision. No, she said, almost under her breath, then louder, no, that would have required a review, at least a discussion. Her eyes flicked toward Mr. Caldwell, searching for contradiction, for correction, for anything that would pull the conversation back into something she could understand. He did not interrupt. He did not soften the moment. He simply observed, which in itself was confirmation enough. My mother leaned forward slightly, her composure now visibly strained. What exactly was removed, she asked, her voice careful, almost cautious, as if she already sensed the answer would not be easy to hear. I turned toward her, keeping my tone steady. A financial link tied to an expansion agreement, I said. One that carried a level of risk the estate could not absorb long-term. Vanessa's eyes moved back to me quickly, sharper now, more focused. You are talking about the partnership, she said. It was not a question. It was recognition arriving too late. I nodded once. Yes. That single word changed everything. The reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Vanessa's expression shifted in a way she could not fully control, the confidence that had defined her earlier now replaced by something far more exposed. You cannot just remove something like that, she said, her voice tightening despite her effort to keep it level. There are agreements in place. There are timelines. That affects real operations. I met her gaze without hesitation. It did, I said calmly. That is why it was addressed. The simplicity of the answer seemed to land harder than any explanation could have. Vanessa leaned forward again, this time with urgency she could no longer hide. That expansion was already in motion, she pressed. There were commitments made. My husband has been building that for months. The room had gone completely still now, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to interrupt what had become something far more significant than a disagreement. I allowed a brief pause, then answered, not raising my voice, not altering my tone. I am aware, I said. That is why it was reviewed carefully before any action was taken. She stared at me, searching, recalculating, trying to find an angle that still made sense, but the structure she had relied on was no longer there. Then why would you do it, she asked, and this time the question was direct, unguarded, stripped of everything she had used earlier to maintain control. I did not look away. Because the numbers did not support the risk, I said. And the exposure extended beyond the individual. Agreement. The words were clear, but what mattered more was what they implied, and I could see that realization forming in her expression, not all at once, but in stages, each piece connecting to something she had not considered before. Her grip on the glass loosened slightly, her posture no longer anchored in certainty. "So you just decided," she said quietly. "You decided it was not worth continuing." I shook my head once, gently, correcting without confrontation. "I decided it was not sustainable under the current terms," I said. "And I acted within the responsibility assigned to me." The distinction mattered, and this time, she felt it. For a moment, no one spoke. Not my mother, not my father, not the guests. Even Mr. Caldwell remained still, allowing the weight of the moment to settle without interruption. Vanessa looked at me, and for the first time that evening, there was no confidence left to hide behind, no performance to rely on, only the realization that something she had believed she controlled had already been decided without her. And that realization did not come with anger first. It came with something much quieter, much more immediate. It came with panic. No one moved right away, and the stillness that followed was not uncertain anymore, it was absolute, the kind that settles when every person in the room understands that something irreversible has just been revealed, and I could feel the weight of it in the way the air itself seemed to hold, like even the smallest movement might break whatever fragile balance was left. Vanessa looked at me, not with the sharp confidence she had carried earlier, but with a focus that was searching, urgent, almost disbelieving, as if she was trying to find a version of this situation where she still had control, where this could still be redirected into something manageable. "You should have told me," she said finally, and this time there was no performance in her voice at all, no attempt to shape the room around her words, just a direct statement that landed with more vulnerability than anything she had said all night. I held her gaze, not dismissing her, not softening the moment, simply present. "You did not ask," I replied calmly. The answer was not harsh, but it was final, and I saw it register in a way nothing else had. She inhaled slowly, her posture shifting again, not defensive this time, but unsettled, as if she was realizing that the version of events she had built in her mind had never included the possibility that she had overlooked something this significant. "That was not something I would think to ask," she said, quieter now, her words slower, more deliberate. "Not when it affects my family directly." I nodded once, acknowledging the weight of that without stepping away from it. "That is exactly why it was handled carefully," I said. "So it would not create a larger issue later." My mother looked between us, her expression no longer composed, but conflicted, as if she was trying to reconcile the conversation she had witnessed at the beginning of the evening with the reality now sitting in front of her. "Tige," she said softly, "this is something that should have been discussed together." I turned toward her, keeping my tone respectful, steady. "It was structured to be managed, not debated," I replied. "That is the difference between involvement and responsibility." The distinction settled heavily, not because it was loud, but because it reframed everything that had been said before it. My father exhaled slowly, his hand resting against the table, his gaze fixed downward for a moment before lifting toward me again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight than it had earlier, less certain, more measured. "You made a decision that affected multiple parties," he said. "That carries consequences." I met his gaze without hesitation. "It does," I said. "That is why it required someone willing to act without waiting for approval that might not come in time." The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that avoided conflict. It was the kind that acknowledged it, that accepted it as part of what had already happened. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her hands now resting flat against the table, no longer gripping anything, no longer anchoring herself in control. "So what happens now?" she asked, and the question came without resistance, without challenge, just a need for clarity that had not existed earlier. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to delay, but to ensure the moment stayed grounded in reality rather than emotion. "Now," I said, "things move forward based on what is sustainable." I did not elaborate further. I did not need to. The answer was simple, but it carried everything that had been decided. Vanessa lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, and for the first time that evening, there was no attempt to reframe, no attempt to redirect, only the quiet recognition that something had shifted beyond her control. Around us, the guests remained still, no one speaking, no one interrupting, each of them understanding that what they had witnessed was not just a disagreement, but a complete reversal of something they had assumed from the moment they sat down. I reached for my glass again, taking a slow sip, then setting it down with the same calm precision I had maintained from the beginning. "Respect," I said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, but allowing the words to settle into the room as they were, "is rarely given when it is needed. It usually arrives after it becomes unavoidable." No one responded. No one disagreed. And that silence, more than anything else, was the only confirmation I needed, because for the first time in that room, I was no longer being defined by what they believed I lacked. I was being acknowledged for what they could no longer ignore.